So we're going to head over to our keynote talk now from Professor Sir John Tooke. We think that you'll really enjoy this, and that we'll then be joined by Sir John Tooke shortly after for a Q&A. So please do keep involved. So we're now going to head over to that presentation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Costa, for that introduction, and hello everybody. I'm delighted to be here to contribute to this particular summit. Clearly MedTech covers a whole range of different technologies, but my focus is going to be reflections on diagnostics, because I think this is a relatively neglected part of the portfolio of technologies. Before I launch into discussing with you two recent national workshops which have given me some insights into the challenges faced by diagnostics and prognostics, perhaps you can indulge me by listening to three brief personal stories that have really triggered my interest in this topic. Now, this is a picture of an air encephalogram. Many of you probably unfamiliar with that particular imaging technique now. It had a formative influence on me in the sense that when I was around 12, which is the type of age that people typically decide they're going to do medicine, my mother had an air encephalogram, which involves drilling a hole in your skull while you're conscious, injecting air into the ventricles of the brain, positioning the patient so that the air moved about, and looking at the indentation on the ventricular system of the tumor or the mass that you were trying to visualize, air acting as a contrast medium. You can imagine that's a distressing and uncomfortable procedure, and one that almost invariably leaves people with a stinking headache. Fast forward 20, 30 years, when my mother had a recurrence of what turned out to be a benign tumour, MRI was in existence, and of course the imaging that she went through on that second occasion was completely different, and a really revelationary advance in terms of removing that invasive component. Now, the second example, again, belies my age. This is the first iteration of Starsky and Hutch, which I imagine everybody's familiar with in its later form. When I was a medical SHO in Devon, Starsky, or was it Hutch? I think it was Starsky, the blonde one on the left-hand side of the screen, was admitted to the hospital I was working at with a fever of unknown origin. My consultant concluded that he had Q fever, which is a rare Coxiella rickettsia infection, often contracted from livestock and causes a very severe pneumonia. The problem in diagnostic terms is that in the 70s, it was reliant on injecting the serum from the patient into a guinea pig and waiting for 2 weeks for the typical butterfly lesions to occur in the lungs of the said guinea pig, who was then sacrificed for the purposes. The problem was that David Soul, or Starsky, contracted this while filming on Dartmoor, which is where he contracted the illness, having been involved with horses and livestock as part of the filming. And it was necessary for the Hollywood company to stop filming for the many weeks that this diagnosis implied, with a multi-million-dollar price tag associated with that. You can imagine, had he had a more urgent diagnostic procedure or a faster diagnostic procedure, the certainty would have been incredibly important. And indeed, today, if you contract Q fever, PCR and serology will give you the answer virtually instantaneously. And then my final, third and final story by way of introduction relates to my own clinical discipline, diabetes. And as part of my higher medical training, I underwent training in pediatric diabetes and endocrinology. The photos on the right-hand side are of one of the first children to be treated with insulin, which in itself was a miracle, in the early 20s. And 3 months later, you can see her normal body build restored. However, there was a remaining technical challenge, which was that of monitoring the condition to make sure that the insulin dose matched the food intake and exercise regime of the child. And for many, many years, decades, it was reliant on urine testing. And I did my pediatric diabetes and endocrinology in Edinburgh, and I remember sitting outside the waiting room of the consultant, Jim Farker, who was seeing the children for their routine follow-up. And I was seated outside alongside half a dozen children who were dutifully filling in their urine testing books somewhat after the event, as you can imagine, so they could present to him a perfect display of perfect control for which they would be congratulated. So in the absence of tests, diagnostic tests to reveal the overall exposure to glucose that these children had experienced, the measurement of their control was, to say the least, imprecise. With the advent of the capacity to measure glycosylated hemoglobin, that challenge was overcome. So 3 examples during my professional life of the way that diagnosis has become advanced and is now such a critical part of the management of every condition. So let's fast forward to the current crisis we're in, the pandemic, and the challenge is faced, particularly in the early months, of responding to the diagnostic testing requirement associated with COVID-19. Now, we're all aware of some of the acrimony and blame that associated those early months when the testing response appeared to be poor or inadequate. And for that reason, in October, I was asked to chair a virtual roundtable which convened experts from academia, industry, and the NHS to consider how the diagnostic testing response had gone and what lessons we could learn so that when we reach the phase we're now in, the third wave, in fact, but the second and third and subsequent waves would benefit from learning from those lessons. And it was, I think, an important meeting which revealed a number of perhaps obvious conclusions, but I think they're worth reiterating. In any crisis, as the COVID pandemic was when it is now, there is a real temptation to leap in and do things. You're obliged to take urgent action. And one of the consequences of that is that the strategic approach can be somewhat undermined. And I think there was a general consensus in the meeting that in the early days, there was a lack of an early expert-informed strategy to dictate how the testing process should unfold. In fact, it was pointed out to me that there was nobody on the initial strategy group who'd ever experienced a case of COVID. Second, and related to that, was that there was an early lack of the definition of the use cases for which testing would be needed. And so therefore, the product profiles and the way to get to the answers was inevitably inhibited. There was also, in my view, a largely sterile debate about whether this should be run nationally or whether this should be done locally. And I think it's pretty clear that you need a combination. You need a national overarching strategic approach, but you have to have mechanisms that take advantage of the local skill, the local opportunities, the local entrepreneurship that collectively with the national effort can combine effectively. And then fourth, in a sense, the whole stimulus for this meeting was the fact that pre-formed partnerships between academia, industry and the NHS are essential in meeting a challenge of this scale, leveraging the relevant strengths within those three sectors. And I think it's important to recognise that those partnerships are difficult to create overnight. They're essentially founded on understanding of one another and the development of trust, best formed over many years. And this led us to feel that that's a very important development that needs to be built on moving forward from where we are now. You could argue that the UK Lighthouse Labs network represents a good example of the NHS, industry and academia coming together, although in the early days there was a lot of criticism about failure to engage fully with all the local strengths and companies that were available. That's in part, I think, in considerable part now rectified, and these networks are seen as a success. It also points up, I think, the value of organisations such as, our sponsor, the Northern Health Science Alliance, which is there to essentially engage those three parties, the academia, industry, and the NHS to common purpose. The Northern Health Science Alliance is a mature alliance, and it's because of that, and because time and effort and resource has been put into building the alliance, that its effectiveness is increasing day by day. The other major lesson, I think, to draw from the COVID testing is an appreciation of the needs of the sector that major in this area, which is the SME sector. There's I think a great temptation to think of all biomedical innovation as relating to pharma. But of course, the SME sector is very different from those very large companies. And the particular challenges that they faced in regard to coming on board with the COVID testing challenge was the degree of risk they were expected to bear, and the challenges to cash flow for smaller companies when contracts were slow to materialize, or they were developing products and services at risk. And these are critical issues that need to be addressed if we're to leverage the real enterprise and entrepreneurship that's evident in that sector. And the overall conclusion, despite the very many strengths within the diagnostic and prognostic sector in the UK, it's fair to say that the sector as a whole is fragmented and underdeveloped. And that's something that needs to be rectified going forward if we're to respond better to future crises such as the pandemic. And indeed, that is pillar 5 of the government strategy in terms of developing a testing response. So it is recognised that this is a sector that needs to be built upon. But a final conclusion from the meeting was the challenges that we've faced in relationship to developing a response to COVID testing are writ large in other areas of medicine. COVID, although clearly a huge global problem, is by no means the only unresolved health problem we face. And diagnostics are absolutely key to rising to those challenges and the opportunities presented by precision medicine and prevention. So attention to the sector has much broader benefits beyond the immediate concerns of COVID. So let's switch attention, if I may, to this whole question of precision medicine, or what has been termed P4 medicine, medicine that's predictive, personalised, preemptive or preventive, and participatory. And it's been the advent, as you know, of technologies such as genomics and other genomics, the capacity to undertake more sophisticated clinical phenotyping, including the use of wearables, etc., and data linkage and data analytics, and the potential of machine learning and AI to interrogate data sets that has opened up this possibility of being far more precise in the way we conduct both medicine and prevention. So just to unpack that a little bit, and the potential for personalised or preemptive approaches, if you can do this, then disease can be tackled at earlier stages when it's more tractable. You clearly avoid the longer term, or minimize the long-term impact of complications of conditions if you nip them in the bud. You might establish better adherence. Adherence to medicines is a major problem that's often underestimated. It's estimated that perhaps only 50% of therapy for long-term conditions is taken, which is clearly a waste at one level. But if you could achieve more precise therapy with a better efficacy side effect ratio, then perhaps people would be more inclined to take the course of treatment. And this preemptive approach provides a mechanism to move beyond dealing with established disease and get into what I think we would all like to see, more health maintenance. So we develop a genuine national health service as opposed to disease service. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the economic consequences that can be anticipated from such an approach: better healthcare value, better sustained employment, reduced care needs, etc. So the theoretical case is sound, and the need for more precise diagnosis and prognosis has been further emphasized to me by other work I'm currently involved in relationship to the development of future hospitals. You'll be aware that the government is embarked on a scheme to redevelop or develop some 40 hospitals, and they demand transformative models of care that can lead to care closer to home, the use of the hospital for that which needs to be there and can't be done in the community, and embracing the prevention agenda. And all of these principles are consistent with the NHS long-term plan of integrated care. That is, the right person being seen in the right setting by the right team. A much more person-centered approach rather than an approach that's determined by either professional convenience or a particular locus of care. Now, to emphasize the point, the formulation and execution of that strategy, which is the NHS long-term plan, is heavily dependent on the means to risk stratify the population and apply point-of-care diagnostics, not waiting for the person necessarily to come to hospital to get the diagnosis, but having technologies that can diagnose people as much as possible within that primary care setting, so the right people are channeled to the right place. So given that set of challenges and its their immediate relevance to the long-term future of the NHS as we move into that phase. We conducted another workshop at the Academy of Medical Sciences under the Forum umbrella. The Forum is a means of bringing those from academia, industry, the regulatory bodies, and the NHS together to talk about common challenges facing medical innovation. And this meeting, held just before Christmas, was on precision prevention for modifiable health risks, those risks for which there are effective interventions, as a route to achieving personalised preventative healthcare. And the things we considered were the technologies themselves, the comparisons between, for example, genomics, data analytics, and proteomics specifically, and then trying to understand how better to evaluate those various technologies so that they would be taken up by the commissioners of health systems, and of course is heavily dependent on having the means to undertake appropriate health economic analyses. And then finally, charting a way forward for generating the evidence required and overcoming some of the funding challenges and risks associated with embarking on the development of new tests for this purpose. So a lot has been made of the potential of genomics to revolutionize medicine. The skeptical might say that, well, that's been said for some nearly 20 years now, and it's a long time coming for many disease areas. And clearly the UK has made a major investment in and is, you know, a leader in terms of the development and application of genomic methodologies for health service benefit. But I think it's important to reflect on what are the determinants of health, and most authorities will accept the genetics accounts for perhaps at most 20 to 30% of one's health status, and other issues such as behavior, social circumstances, and the environment account for arguably the majority. So genomics is intrinsically limited in terms of what it can tell you about your risk of disease. An alternative approach is to say, well, look, if you bring in all the data that's possible to link, so demographic data, clinical data, phenotypic data, allied with measures of biological relevance, including genomics, then you might get a more complete picture of somebody's health status or the risks that they're exposed to. And there are good examples of that type of approach being enacted. And Andrew Morris, my friend and colleague, is now director of HDR UK, has majored on this and demonstrated in Scotland that it's possible to apply this type of approach, and more importantly has demonstrated that people with diabetes materially benefit from this approach through improvement of outcomes in terms of blindness, amputation, and indeed mortality. However, there are numerous problems associated with this type of data integration and analysis. It's no easy task. There's the challenge of digital immaturity in many of our health systems. Data standards have to be maintained. The quality of all the inputs is crucial. Interoperability is crucial. And there is concerns over public trust in data holding, as well as professional trust in the algorithms used to drag out analyses from those data. So prerequisites are a data science strategy, a level of digital maturity, and importantly, a receptive, engaged, and integrated healthcare system. which can use the insights so gained. So all of those are not easy challenges to meet. And so it brings me to a suggestion that as a stepping stone perhaps to that fully data-linked system, which is clearly an ambition that many health systems have, proteomics acts as an important technology that can help us in our desire to create more precise diagnosis and prognosis. And here I should declare a competing interest because I advise the company SomaLogic, whose data I'm going to discuss with you. Just for some background, there are over 5,000 proteins in human plasma. SomaLogic are able to measure 7,000 of them now in a single tiny blood sample. And they reflect critically the integration of all the genetic, environmental, social, and behavioral determinants of health. The proteins are the effector molecules, if you will, and are the downstream end product of genomics, transcriptomics, etc. And so give you that biologically integrated view of your biology and health status. So what's it able to do? So in simple terms, a sample is taken, all the proteins, or in this case, some thousand are measured, data is extracted and interpreted, and a report generated. How can one move from that measurement to analysis step? It's through doing these sorts of measurements on many, many thousands of patients who've had tests, conventional tests, the most accurate test to define risk or health status, and then developing, using machine learning, a model on the protein data to find the protein spectrum that actually offers an equivalent or better prediction of health status. And that's what's been done. And if I show you the data from some of the first 9 tests developed, if you're interested in the detail, this was reported in Nature Medicine a little over 12 months ago. All these tests are in the sort of cardiometabolic sphere. So whether you want to know somebody's risk of a heart attack in the next 4 years, or their liver fat composition, or their cardiorespiratory fitness, or their glucose tolerance, you can derive all of that from a protein scan, and you can derive it in a manner that is better than currently available standard tests. So many of those standard tests are often more invasive and certainly more expensive. So here in one blood test, you have the capacity to measure these 9 things, and in theory and indeed in practice, there's no limit to the number of tests and predictive indices that can be derived from this. There are 100 plus in the pipeline to build on this initial armamentarium. So that's just one plug for different ways of looking at prognostics and diagnostics using new technologies. So what were the inferences we drew from this workshop on technologies to identify modifiable risk? The first was that the diagnostic industries lack the financial model to bear all of the development risk. And that's further compounded by the fact that there is an emphasis on single-use companion diagnostics rather than the sorts of platforms that I've described, which have multiple applications. As with any field of medical innovation, there are NHS adoption challenges. Is the NHS digitally mature enough to embrace these type of approaches? There's what I describe as pathway redesign inertia. It's not just a question of selling a new test. That's not the only cost the health system has to consider. If it's a truly transformative approach, somebody has got to redesign the pathway of care, and seldom is resource available for that important facilitatory function. And then third, when we take account, or when commissioners take account of these issues, they seldom have access to the longer term economic gain that could be had if you developed a well-designed preemptive approach. So what are the potential solutions? And I think the first is a better acknowledgement by the NHS of the need for risk stratification and better risk stratification and point of care testing to realise the ambitions of the integrated care system. As I say, when I look at the hospital transformation programmes in which I'm engaged, there seems to be an underappreciation of the importance of that. The NHS should then develop target product profiles. What is important to it in terms of improving patient outcomes? Where should the focus be? Because if developers had that information, then they could go about the business of developing solutions with at least greater confidence that what they produced might ultimately be commissioned. The development needs to embrace risk sharing, and I suspect that for many major developments we'll need public and third sector funding to bridge the funding risk that development of these truly transformative products means. Regulators will need to embrace adaptive licensing of promising tools so that they can be got into the market faster. And by the same token, NICE will need to develop more appropriate evaluation strategies. With Genomics England, which you could argue has been a great national success, there was a leap of faith involved in terms of the potential of the technology. And I would argue that the same leap of faith needs to be made in terms of some of the other omic technologies that could play a leading part in the transformation of medicine. So, in conclusion, I've tried to argue that diagnostics and prognostics have received insufficient attention, and COVID has exposed just how insufficient that attention has been. These technologies are key to health service transformation. Therefore, what we've learned from COVID must be redressed if we're to realise the ambitions of the NHS long-term plan. And critical within that is that the challenges facing would-be developers need to be addressed and the financial and regulatory barriers mitigated. And I do believe there is a huge opportunity in the UK to build this sector as a critical part of the life sciences strategy and a focal point for productive interaction between academia, industry and the NHS, ultimately for patient benefit. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, that was a fantastic presentation, and we're going to be joined now by Sir John, who will be answering some questions from us and also from everybody that's been posting on the chat. The presentation I found was really interesting for myself. I've just recovered from COVID, was in hospital on oxygen last week, so was surprised that I was actually was here. But yeah, we've now got Sir John with us, so he should be appearing very shortly on screen. Hello there, Sir John. Thank you for joining.
Hi there, Costa. John will suffice. Hi.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. It was really insightful. You've got such a fantastic career that you've had, and And in particular, everything you were saying about COVID testing is very, very relevant today. I've just recovered from COVID myself. I was on oxygen last week in hospital, so surprised I'm actually here, but thankful. And I think everything you were saying about diagnostics is so important right now. So thank you so much for that presentation. And we've got some questions that we wanted to ask you, and also we've got a few from the audience to share with you. So I wondered if you could give us your views on how evidence is used to assess the risks and benefits of medical technologies and devices, considering the process seems well established and mature for medicinal products.
Indeed. Well, Costa, first of all, glad to see you back with us and looking well. It must have been a very scary experience, so
Absolutely.
Pleased to hear that. And thank you for those kind comments. Look, I think one of the principal problems when it comes to regulating and introducing technologies, and in my spheres, particularly diagnostics, is that the regulatory focus tends to be on performance rather than the beneficial outcomes that might accrue from a new technology or diagnostic. And therein lies the problems, because generating outcome data, for example, a new prognostic, may take many, many years and may be a complex set of issues. For example, if you predict somebody at high risk of something and it is ultimately prevented, and there are downstream benefits in terms of avoiding complications from a disease or carer costs or somebody being able to sustain their employment or not. Those are the real those are the things one's trying to impact. But to prove that case over many, many years is a very difficult undertaking, and one in which, because of the nature of the MedTech industries, they're seldom geared to be able to commit that level of time and resource to achieve those sorts of data. Contrast that with medicinal products, often driven by big pharma, which have a different resource base to work from, and they may be able to get regulatory approval for an impact that's demonstrable within a shorter period of time. So therein lies a problem, and an expectation that you can simply transfer that same regulatory approach across to medtech and diagnostics is I think ill-conceived. Of course, much of the focus in diagnostics is on companion diagnostics or technologies which have relevance to a single disease, whereas actually what we often need is a more platform approach which can be applied much more broadly, and again expecting a smaller enterprise to be able to entertain the type of studies that would achieve regulatory approval is I think simply unrealistic, and leads one to the belief that there needs to be some form of public-private partnership funding model to address that. And it's interesting when you reflect on Genomics England, huge political and capital commitment behind that, but it in a sense has been a leap of faith in terms of public finances to commit to that, which demonstrates exactly what you need to do if you're going to get a transformative technology at scale introduced into a healthcare system. So many problems to address. Potential solutions, I think, if, for example, if funding agencies were able to commit to more health economic studies earlier in the development of a program. It tends to be something that happens in academic circles towards the end of the research and development process. If regulators could adopt a more conditional licensing, adaptive licensing approach, so there was some revenue return earlier in the process rather than waiting for a full normal regulatory approval, and the accrual and use of real-world data, which we're seeing increasingly, of course, in the medicines field, could again help that more iterative adoption and resourcing.
That's very interesting. And looking forward now, in a post-COVID world, what principles do you think will be key to successful MedTech collaborations coming about?
Yeah, well, I think COVID, as I tried to illustrate a little in my talk, has sort of opened our eyes as to many of the challenges and potential ways forward. I mean, I suppose the obvious thing to say is that when you get an existential threat like COVID, you do get alignment of interests. There's a common purpose. People come together and forget the normal challenges. Now that exposes, I think, as I think our report tried to demonstrate, some of the smaller players and less well-funded players poses risks for them, because we were told repeatedly of smaller companies had risen to the challenge or tried to contribute. Contracts were slow to be effected. They went at risk committing their own resources and funding to development of testing approaches, for example. And that's just not viable if you're a small company. You might be able to bear it if you're a bigger organization. So that, I think, was a particular challenge, and one that needs to be addressed going forward as well. I think one of the key things that came across was that the importance of fusing or creating truly collaborative partnerships between the health system, industry, and academia. They're difficult to forge overnight. They're built on trust and common purpose. And all the effort that can be put into nurturing those alliances puts you in a much better position to respond speedily when a crisis emerges or an opportunity emerges. So, and I think that's why I'm such a fan of, for example, the Northern Health Science Alliance, because essentially that's what it does. It helps foster that partnership, create the sorts of linkages that can then be leveraged when they need to be for a crisis such as this. And I think the other fundamental learning from the COVID situation is that, you know, we need to establish systems of, and I think it's true more generally for MedTech development, there needs to be shared risk and reward between the developer and the market into which it plays. It's often a one-sided conversation, with the developer being expected to bear a huge amount of risk and the reward, if it comes, very late in the day.
I think you're totally right with that. There was a number of startups responding to grants that Innovate UK put out there at the beginning, and right now, you know, this is why we've done this summit, really, to bring together those MedTech startups that are exhibiting later on. It's very important that academia, as you say, you know, can provide that research IP supporting with patient focus groups, that such as what NIHR MedTech Cooperative do, and also the funding is there as well, whether it's grants or private sector investment.
Yes.
So I think you made some very valid and excellent points. And I guess that brings me on to my last question from myself before we go to the audience, which is, you've had such a wonderful career. what have you learned professionally at this stage in your career that you wish you'd known at the start of your career?
Yeah, well, lots and lots. But I think probably the thing that struck me most as my career has developed is that, you know, you go through phases in a career like mine where you focus on clinical practice, see some of the unresolved challenges, get involved in education and research as a means to address them. But I suppose the fundamental deficiency in myself, I noted, was essentially a lack of awareness of the process of medical innovation, what it takes to achieve genuine impact. I mean, most people go into medicine or medical science because they want to make an impact, but in the academic field, you can get diverted into what might be regarded as, you know, surrogate outcomes, you know, publications and other reputationally enhancing things, which aren't necessarily about genuine health impact. So an understanding of what creates impact, I think, would have been very valuable at the beginning, and a deeper understanding of the process of medical innovation, by which I mean not just advancing a bit of research along the translational chain. I mean actually something that benefits society, plus or minus some commercial benefit associated with it as well. And when I reflect on that, I'm always minded when thinking about impact of some work that Rand Europe did in 2010, which looked at research activity and the critical determinants of health and socioeconomic impact. And I think it's quite an instructive analysis, because it emphasizes some of the points we've already mentioned. Firstly, the critical importance of what you do being informed by genuine health need. So connectivity with the patient or citizen perspective is important, translated into a series of use cases and ultimately target product profiles. So getting clarity around that is critically important. So often in the field of technological development, it will be a smart technological idea, but actually does it have real relevance to the health needs that people are presenting with? Second is the second determinant of impact that analysis points up is the real importance of engaging with industry, relevant industry, early on in that process. You know, it's this symbiotic relationship between the research and academic community and industry. They both bring different things to the process, and when they align well, then the end product is better informed. The approach and stages that need to be fulfilled are more likely to be so. And then I suppose the third thing that always strikes me about achieving impact is the power of interdisciplinarity. If you want new ideas and new insights, you don't get them by doing things the same way you ever did. If you can bring different disciplines together, their different perspectives mean that you're more likely to generate novel concepts. And what's more, and this is a point that's often neglected, if your ideas are generated by a broader community, those ideas get more traction because people take them back to their own individual communities, and therefore the ideas are more likely to flourish. So that interdisciplinary approach has very much been part of my research career. And I think it's something that when we're progressing medical innovation, we should always be looking to bring in new perspectives to help drive that process. And I, as a manifestation of my deficiencies, as it were, and recognition of need, some years back we formed a collaborative, called CASME, the Collaboration for the Advancement of Sustainable Medical Innovation, which seeks to build a social movement interested in these various issues so that future generations will be far better equipped than I was when I started my career, so that people can fulfill their ambitions and create impactful solutions that really benefit people's health.
I think those are some very insightful insights from you. I think it'll help a lot of the doctors that are on this call that's from the MedTech Foundation that are at the early stage of their careers. So thank you very much for those insights.
My pleasure.
Sorry, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on because the sessions are due to begin. We do have 2 questions from the audience, but what we'll do is we'll get those to you via email and answer them via email for our audience.
Okay, with pleasure.
But thank you
very much, Costa.
So much for joining us, and feel free to join us for the roundtables if you have any availability. But thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye now.